Welcome to the People's Forum. Welcome back, America. Welcome back. We're picking up where we left off. This is part two of James Baldwin, American author, Conscience, with his niece, the wonderful Aisha Karefa Smart. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for coming back.
Thank you for having me.
I want to pick up here because as much of the essayist and the writer, he was a public speaker and a phenomenal interview. I mean, I think, you know, in 1959, 1965, he could literally stand on the stage with a cigarette, you know, and a cup of coffee and speak for 5 hours. Some of his, one of the two most profound interviews that I saw him, heard him give was to the CBS correspondent, Joanne Martin Burke. And what I took from that is something that I got in my post-grad studies in terms of, I study as a KSAC, substance abuse counselor, and our professor, we have, there's a module in New York State that has, that deals with integrity and cultural competence and do no harm and things of that nature. And you would think that most people wouldn't have to take a class to know not to do harm to others, but we spend about 16 hours of that module dealing with cultural confidence and knowing that if I'm sitting down with a Hasidic family, that I'm not supposed to touch his wife's hand. If I'm sitting with a Muslim family, I'm not supposed to, you know, shake his wife's hand. Just different things. And what happens most times in our community is we have the burden of knowing everything not to do, both in Black America and in white America, but white America has no burden to know what not to do when dealing with us. So I picked out some of these questions because your uncle handled them phenomenally. You know, he generally knocked them out of the park like a softball pitch. And one of the things that she said that was amazing, she herself had to backtrack and say, well, these are horrible questions. And she asked, are Black people deeply religious? I almost couldn't speak to that. I mean, could you please speak to that?
To the question?
To the question, yeah. To the question.
Are we deeply religious?
No.
Meaning the question
to
that
the
she
lack
asked?
of cultural
Well,
awareness that would make someone ask a question of that nature.
Yeah. It's often assumed that because people have positions of importance and positions of power that they're well informed, that they're educated, that they understand the subject matter at hand, and oftentimes that's not the case. I would say in the age of social media and in the digital age, people are being held accountable for not being informed when they speak to certain things. But that's something that happens all the time when you're interviewed by people who are not committed to truth being rendered and to accuracy, when they're more interested in a spin or maybe making you look like a fool because you are always so intelligent and so proficient. And you know, he was just phenomenal in his ability to be able to speak truth to power in a way that people who had much more learning than he did couldn't speak to. He had a high school education. So I question when people ask questions like that.
That's only on paper. Because,
yeah, that's on paper. Right. You and I understand that, but, you know, there are people who, you know, still don't understand how amazing it is to write at the level that he wrote and speak at the level that he spoke. To
and
not be formally right, and many different disciplines, to not be formally educated. So when that happens, I just, you know, I have to laugh sometimes because I realize that the person is not really trying to get at the truth here. You know, are Black people deeply religious? Well, what is the intent of you of that question? What is behind that question? So you have to learn how to read in between the lines, and he knew how to do that, and he knew how to throw stuff back at people and have them answer their own question. So that happens all the time, and we spoke about the importance of interviewers. It's a skill to be able to curate questions that draw forth the information that you're seeking to. But was she seeking to learn anything, or did she just want to throw out questions and be on the defensive?
Well, I think it was, the normal cops and robbers, good
Yeah,
and bad,
yeah, good and
white
bad,
hat,
and
black
let's
hat,
cast
and,
these people
yeah,
as simpletons.
We're going to bring in James Baldwin,
Right,
and
ask
he's going to
him.
say something that's inflammatory because he's a militant.
Right.
Yeah. He's a militant.
Yeah.
So one of the things that she asked, she says that this was at the end of the Korean War, and she says, and I remember a famous black doctor speaking about this as well, that black soldiers somehow fared better when they were in prisoner of war camps undergoing torture and brainwashing than that of white, officers and soldiers. Many times they didn't break, and she seemed to think that they had something extra to fall back on. What do you think that was?
Years of white supremacy.
Exactly.
And living under, the threat of death and terrorism at all times.
If you're used to having nothing, it was just what happened in Vietnam.
Right.
The Vietnamese soldiers were used to living and surviving
in the jungle.
In the jungle, a cup of rice, a handful of water, or some rainwater.
There's no way you can beat that.
And they didn't require anything else.
Right. So it's hard to
when
fight
it gets
against
taken
people.
away from you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, it's just it's the weathering, the having weathered the storm here in America, and oftentimes having to come back and be treated just as bad or worse than you were, when you were serving.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Do you think your uncle received better in Europe than he was here? Because he was, greatly received in France, greatly received in Britain and London?
He was left alone, which, he said that's pretty much what black men are asking, is to be left alone, not to be harassed. He understood that France and Europe had its own race issues, and that there were people who stood in proxy. So if it wasn't African Americans in Paris, it was the Algerians who were the, quote unquote,
Negroes.
Right, exactly. So he never made the assumption that there was no racism, but it was constructed differently, and because he was African American, was not the target of the France's angst. Their direct concern was Algerians, because they had a closer relationship because of the colonization of Algeria by France. So it's always about proximity. Whoever I'm oppressing, that's who I'm concerned with at this moment. So he understood that France had its own racial problem, but he was able to write and for the most part be left alone, and for the most part be able to live his life as he wanted to. Yeah.
The author, she asked him a question about his anger, and she asked him, had his anger diminished? At this time, he was 55 years old. Can you speak to his comments here?
His famous quote is, to be black and relatively conscious in America is to be in a state of rage almost all the time. I mean, that's not something that you can explain to another person. But if
that's
that other
psychological diagnosis.
Right. Well, and if another person witnessing what black people are subjugated to can't understand that, then that's their own blindness. That's willful blindness. Because anybody who's relatively conscious, black or white, who watches and sees the type of injustices that take place, it's what do you do with that? What do you do with that sense of injustice, that anger and that rage? So
well,
yeah.
I think he said you put a name to it.
Yeah, exactly.
If you can put a name to it,
that's something where people expect you to mellow out. They expect you to after you reach a certain age, not to be so angry, and but injustice is injustice.
Well, and she also tried to say, well, look at you, you did it,
Right.
and he eloquently says, I am not a performing monkey.
Right, exactly. For other people to look at.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I've done this
Yeah, but he went through great challenges. He went through great
And he spoke to
moments of
what
dark.
a personal miracle
He was.
it is and was
Right, for
for
him
him
to
to have
triumph.
come through all
Absolutely.
of those trials and tribulations. I mean,
Absolutely.
you have to walk a gauntlet
Absolutely.
to get to the same place and be sitting next to William F. Buckley.
Right,
You
exactly.
know, you have to walk a gauntlet.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
One of the things, and I'm going to read it so I don't misquote it, and he says, an Irishman in Ireland is Irish, but in America he's white. Whiteness is a matter of safety where I have to remain black to ensure your safety. Like, I have to stay in the villain's role.
In order for the definition of whiteness to mean anything. He also said whiteness is a metaphor for power.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, these are all conversations that we need to be having as a nation in our communities. You know, to understand that in order for you to be white, I have to be the opposite of white and be deemed
The good
the
guy
villain.
needs a black guy.
Right,
bad
exactly.
guy. Yeah.
Right. So that is an occupation that I didn't choose for myself. I didn't designate it. And that's why some people advocate that we should stop referring to ourselves, that black is actually a legal term, and that we should, you know, I don't have a problem with it because during the 60s we flipped it. We took it and we made it something to be proud of. We said black is beautiful. James Brown says, "Say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud." It became something that we switched it and we said blackness is beautiful, blackness is grand, blackness is wonderful. But in terms of the black-white, you know, dichotomy in terms of what they mean in the English language, it is something to look at because that carries weight. You know, the actual definition of the word in our language, what does it mean? And why, you know, my uncle said, you invented the N-word, and you need to look at yourself and ask why you invented it, why you needed somebody to be the N-word in order for you to occupy a certain space within the society. It was a creation of your own, and are you willing to let go of it? And I think the answer is no, because so many people came from various parts of Europe where they were nothing. They were
Now
peasants.
they have an identity.
And they have a collective identity that is based on the subjugation and the dehumanization of another segment of society. So that's a lot, and you have to look at that and ask, why would you want that?
Okay, we have another few minutes, but I want to ask one last question before our break, and I want to frame it in terms of Barack Obama, the first, you know, African American, as they say, president, and tokenism and gestures. What do you think your uncle's opinion would have been to realizing the fact that we had a black president, quote unquote, and whether or not the gesture was real or was it a token gesture, one in a number of 45?
Well, I'll use his words. He was not so much concerned as Robert F. Kennedy one day so eloquently said that one day you too could be president of the United States. And he said he was not so much concerned about a black person being the president of the United States, but what kind of country he would be president of. And that's the question, because it's not about the color of the person, it's about the state of the nation that that person is ruling over. And if it's a black president and it's the same old, it's the same injustice, it's the same brutality, it's the same death and despair, then it is a token. It is a token gesture. It doesn't mean what we think it means because the person just becomes a symbol of something, but underneath people are still suffering.
Yeah, when he was in Chicago and the movement was going through Chicago, he said that the black workers here want jobs.
Right, exactly. That's
They don't
it.
care about anything else.
Right, exactly.
They want the
jobs.
ability to
Right,
take care of their families.
With dignity.
With dignity.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, when we come back, I'm going to deal with some of his most famous quotes. I'm going to deal with, of course, we have to go back to the religion question. And lastly, we're going to deal with the brand new project that you guys just finished that just aired yesterday.
Okay.
Okay? So we'll be right back. Okay, we're back. We're back, and we have 10 minutes to go. So I'm going to fire some questions and some quotes at you.
Go right ahead,
and I
brother.
want you to be just as
I'm ready. This has
just
been 30 years in the making.
30 years in the making. I want you to be the reincarnation of your uncle. Okay, religion.
Religion. He said about church on Sunday being the most segregated hour. He quoted Malcolm X saying, "High noon is the most segregated hour in the country." He said that the Christian religion, he couldn't afford to trust the average white Christian because he saw what they often did, and also the fact that they wouldn't worship with black people. So religion was a thing for him because he grew up as a boy preacher, but I think he was more interested in the spiritual aspect of the teachings of Christ, not the religion that came after, which was to...
I believe he called it the organic nature,
Yeah, yeah.
Of where that spirituality
It
comes
comes
from.
from, and that's what my grandmother taught, and it was about love, loving your fellow man and treating your fellow man as he deserved to be treated, So that was his religion, love.
Violence.
Violence. Definitely anti-violent, but he understood the Panthers. He understood the other movements who felt the importance of bearing arms, but he did not agree with it. He believed his pen was his sword, and he used his pen as his sword to bring truth and to cut away at the ugliness of racism and the brutality of the system. His pen was his mightiest sword, and it's still cutting.
I mean, and from a man who was slight in stature,
Right,
he was a brutal warrior
absolutely.
when it came to that to his pen in that mouth.
Absolutely. People cannot question, people attacked his sexuality and called him all kinds of names, but to me, he was the epitome of what a black man is in terms of his ability to stand up and speak on behalf of his people and put his life on the line. Unapologetically. Like, how could you question someone's manhood who would speak the truth on the level that he did and would not waver and would not back down? Even when people said, "Oh, okay, well, we want you to write something different," he didn't shy away. He wrote Evidence of Things Not Seen, one of his most unpopular books, because black children were being killed in Atlanta, and he wanted to investigate that. And he was
were being killed in Atlanta, and I think for him a very turbulent time was the bombings, bombings in
Birmingham. Absolutely.
And those 4 young ladies that he
absolutely.
often
so he spoke
to.
truth to power and was courageous beyond what most people ever get to exhibit in their lifetimes. And so to question, him, his ability, his warriorhood, his love and his fierce, fight for black people using his pen and his voice. It's,
He had an idea, and I wonder if it came from France, because he spent so much time, I believe 12 years there at one point.
Never consistently.
No, not consistently, but I'm just from a point in the 50s to a point in the 60s, where he says that people do not give up things. Things have to be taken from them in terms of power. Like if a person has power and they have privilege,
they're not going to give it away.
They're not just going to give it away. It has to be taken.
Yep,
and
absolutely.
I liken that to the French Revolution and how they had to storm the Bastille and actually, bring those people out of there to change that thing, at least momentarily, to change it around.
Yep. I think that's why he was welcomed in France, because they understood, and that was part of their historical past of, revolutionary thought and words and actions, and because that was part of their history, his voice was able to resonate there, and they didn't fear him. They understood.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another quote, the American identity refuses to be black in America, in a country where very few can prove that they're white. What does that mean?
Well, it means that, as he said, Europeans came to this country to become white. They came from various tribes and various identities, and usually were poor, and usually were not of the ruling class. And so they were, in fact, the very thing that they made us into. Here, they were that in their country.
Exactly.
And so they came here and created this white identity to be able to access some sort of ruling, class that they weren't able to access in the countries that they came from. And so he understood that whiteness was a construct. It was a creation. It was something that was created. The science behind it is false. The whole thing about the large skull versus all of that has been debunked. Dr. Joy Leary talks about that in her lectures in terms of post-traumatic slave syndrome and the whole mythology that was created. It was called science, but it was not a science.
No, but it was eugenics and everything else that
and
came
all
with
of that
it.
stuff. All of that stuff was propaganda and used to, speak to to prove the inferiority of black people, and it's just not real. And so he understood that whiteness wasn't real. That whiteness was a construct. It was something made up and a place that people stepped into and occupied.
Well, it seemed like, well, it seemed like imperialism, as he always called it, was just another word for robbery. He says that when white people show up in Aboriginal lands, they show up with the Bible. As years pass, white people then end up with the land, and the indigenous end up with the Bible.
Right.
And somehow, that exchange wasn't fair
well,
at
that
all.
was one of the weapons, that was used. But actual guns and actual firearms and actual firepower,
Well,
absolutely.
The military strength stands behind.
Right, exactly.
Exactly.
So he understood all of these things because he read so deeply, and his knowledge of world history based on his readings was so deep that he was able to make the connections to things that other people might miss. And because he traveled and because he understood the character and the human soul and human nature and what people will do when they want to occupy a place of importance,
What do you think when, if I say that he was often provoked, or they attempted to provoke him by pointing at sexuality or trying to use sexuality as some sort of...
Well, that's why he wrote Giovanni's Room. He said, no one could ever blackmail me because you didn't tell me, I told you. So he rendered that bare at the beginning of his career so that, no one could use that as a tool of blackmail for him. He very comfortably lived in his skin, and he refused to be put in a box. He didn't like to be called anything. He said, I've loved some men and I've loved some women. And that was his call. He said that, but his business was about the business of liberation for black people.
For his people.
And that's what he was interested in. And talks of his sexuality and all of that were something that he lived with it and he dealt with it, but he, didn't, I think the movement caught up with him, in terms of where we are now, in terms of discussing sexuality and things of that sort. But he just knew that he was a man who wanted to be treated fairly.
Like a man.
Like a man, absolutely.
If I make the statement that America does not seem to remember its obligation to black people, what would you say?
Well, I would say that America doesn't feel like it has an obligation to black people. I just don't think that feeling or that sentiment exists. It just doesn't. In terms of, how we are still treated as second-class citizens, maybe even third, because immigrants are able to come and occupy a space that we, in the country of our birth, are not able to occupy. I don't believe America feels any sort of obligation, any, remorse for the way we've been treated. And I'm talking collectively. I'm not talking about individual people. I'm sure there are individual people who feel that way, but collectively, on a government level, on a cultural level, there's a saying that's floating around that America loves black culture but hates black people.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that's what I see. I see, cultural appropriation at its highest. I see our music, our art, our literature, our song, our dance, music, everything is part of the American, the American landscape. It is, but us as a people still remain subjugated. And
Well, I mean, and I want to touch on, just really quickly, mention something about Ellison and being invisible. And then lastly, we have 2 minutes. I want to let you close out with Beale Street. So
Okay.
when your uncle always said that to be black in America was to be invisible, to be the maid, to be the driver, to be somebody just moving around, but not actually heard or seen.
well, that remains true for the masses of our people. People like to use the excuse that we have Oprah and that we have, famous people. We have LeBron James. We have, people. We have Beyonce and Jay-Z, and we have all these people who are incredibly successful and incredibly wealthy, but their position hasn't changed the reality for the masses of black people. So we can't exchange the success of a few and say that means that the sentiment towards us and how we are treated has changed at all. There's still a long ways to go. Yes, you can make a lot of money in America, and that speaks to like what capitalism and where that plays. But you can be extremely successful in Black in America. But can you be Black in America and be working class and feed your family and be treated with dignity and be treated with respect and not be profiled?
Okay.
That's the question.
I've got to have you back again because I really wanted to get you to speak to Beale Street.
It
So,
premiered.
please.
It premiered at the Apollo Theater this past week, and it will be in theaters in November. And it's a love story that needed to be told. And happy that Barry Jenkins was the one to tell it.
All right. And with that, I'll say Black Love is a revolutionary act.
Yes, absolutely.
And I'm glad that Beale
Yeah.
Street is now in the theaters.
Yes.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you, Kwame.
coming.
It's
We
been
got to have you back.
wonderful. I would
This
love
is
to
my
come back.
Kennedy sister.
Yes.
And it's been wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
People's Forum, I'm Kwame Ennis. Thank you very much for having us, and we'll see you next time.